Runescape has had 20 years of world building, and one of my favorite things about the world of Gielinor is that, for the most part, many of the great characters and figureheads of the story of Runescape have been part of the world for most of those 20 years. And you can't speak about the most iconic characters of the Runescape world without talking about its gods. In a way, Runescape's story is the story about the relationship between mortals and their gods. Some gods are perceived as villainous, and others noble. Whether to wear Saradomin trimmed armor or Zamorak trimmed armor was truly an important decision for many young Runescape players, if you could afford it. But there was, and there is, another god. Someone you probably didn't find out about until you dug up that strange symbol in the dig site. You know of it, the equidistant cross surrounded by a circle with 4 rounded jets. The symbol of Zaros, a god that was forgotten for thousands of years, and in old school Runescape represents much of the hidden mythos of the world, always associated with mystery and wonder. But Zaros is more than just ancient magics and cool symbols. He is one of the oldest and most powerful beings in the Runescape universe, with goals and ambitions for himself and others that will take us through thousands of years of history and even some speculation into the future. This is the beginning of the story of Zaros. Zaros' story begins on the planet Runescape. He was created alongside his sister Seren by the elder god Ma, uncounted eons ago. Ma, although capable of creating life, had the mind of an infant child, and saw Zaros and Seren as companions to calm her existence of pain and nightmares due to her being starved of Anima Mundi, the life force of the universe. Much like a child forced to take care of a sick relative, Zaros came to resent his role as simply a companion to the sickly god, and eventually he left Runescape after being her plaything for potentially millions of years, leaving his sister Seren behind. Zaros explored the cosmos and came across the demonic races of the planet Infernus, where he observed them and learned their strange language. He observed the vampires' homeworld of Vampirium, and finally he came upon a planet called Gielinor. At this time in Gielinor's history, Guthix was already asleep, and various gods had already found the planet and carved out their own slice of history, establishing followers of their own, Saradomin being one of the most notable. Zaros saw these gods as merely pretenders, arrogant mortals who had ascended to godhood through the use of the various elder artifacts. They were gods of opportunity and happenstance. None of them were truly of a divine origin as Zaros was. He saw their desire for power as pure arrogance. The mortal races of Gielinor deserved a better class of god, and Zaros decided that he would give it to them, as well as teach the other self-proclaimed gods humility. The first thing Zaros needed to execute this plan was military might. He knew just where to find them too. Zaros returned to the demon homeworld of Infernus and conferred with their leader, a Chthonian demon named Hostilius. Hostilius rose to power on Infernus by rising up against the demonic ruling class, the Infernals of the planet's namesake. His uprising was successful at ripping power from the Infernal class. Hostilius then consumed many of his former masters whole, which increased his size considerably. After claiming power of the world this way, Hostilius outlawed all physical conflict and made it so all disputes and conflicts would need to be solved through written contracts. This created an incentive for demonkind to become intimately familiar with the legality of contracts and finding ways to trick and manipulate the other party through said contracts. Zaros, who had observed this world and its way of doing business for quite some time, was very familiar with this practice, though he did not disclose this to Hostilius. Zaros made his request to Hostilius for 12 demonic legions, for which he would be able to invade Gielinor with. He offered that in exchange for the 12 legions, he would show Hostilius how to travel between worlds like he was able to do. He claimed that this would allow the demonic race to consume other races instead of cannibalizing their own. Of course, Zaros had no intention of this actually happening. In the binding contract that Hostilius had written up, it stated that the legions would go to the eldest signatory. Since Hostilius was many thousands of years old and thought Zaros ignorant of this fact, he proposed the contract to Zaros. Zaros signed the contract knowing that Hostilius had made a grave miscalculation, as Zaros was eons older than Hostilius. After revealing this to Hostilius after the signing, he could do nothing but submit to Zaros. He pledged his armies to him in exchange for nothing. Zaros opened a portal back to Gielinor with one of the legions. He first sought to stake claim to an area that would eventually become Verak. At the time, though, this area was ruled over by a cruel Hydra that had somehow risen to god status. This Hydra was named Lorneb. Lorneb preyed upon the local population and demanded regular sacrifices in order to sate his hunger and ego. You might be able to see similarities between Lorneb and another. Zaros lured Lorneb out of hiding with a great ceremony with sacrifices and chants, praising the Hydra god's greatness. Lorneb took the bait, but soon discovered that it was all a trick, and began to attack Zaros' forces. The demons were able to cut off the Hydra's heads, but more heads would sprout in their place. Soon the Hydra had 12 heads, and began to actually overpower the demons. Zaros then stepped onto the battlefield and goaded Lorneb into a charge. Zaros placed a trap beneath his feet and stepped out of the way of the Hydra's charge at the last second. The trap was triggered, and Zaros' magic ensnared the huge Hydra god. Zaros then began to siphon the Hydra's divine power to create a portal large enough to bring in the remaining demonic legions from Infernus. This drained the Hydra of his power and turned him to stone. His stone corpse was left as a symbol of Zaros' power. This would begin the colonization of the world in the name of Zaros. He united what would eventually become the kingdoms of Mislan and Fornthry. He created the first human priesthood when they traveled the world to spread the word of Zaros' teachings. Slowly, almost all the human tribes of the Second Age would become followers of Zaros. He would establish his capital city of Sentistan, which would become the jewel of the Zarosian Empire, and his empire would expand in all 4 directions, occupying what we now know as the Wilderness, Mauritania, Misthalin, and Asgarnia. It was an empire of vastly increasing power and influence, but because of the military classes being made up of demons, it made life for the less powerful mortal races such as humans to be hard, as they often had to live in abject poverty, as they didn't have much to offer a god dead set on dominating the entirety of the planet. This goal would occupy Zaros' time for the next almost 1,000 years. Now let's take a step back. We will continue Zaros' personal story in part 2, but I think it's important to address what truly makes Zaros so memorable as a character. What type of philosophy makes him one of the most beloved gods in the history of Runescape and among the real players that engage in that world? Believe it or not, the gods of the world of Runescape operate quite a lot like actual rulers and leaders of our world. They have ambitions and desires for their own personal gain, as well as a vision of how the world should be. Zaros remains an extremely compelling character, as well as providing a compelling philosophy, should you decide to be a follower of his. And if you dislike Zaros, you must realize that it is probably why you dislike him that allows others to like him so much, as that makes him dynamic and complex. The worst and best leaders of our world have had enormous followings for these reasons. So why would you be a follower of Zaros? I'll first make the case for why you should be a follower of Zaros, and then why you shouldn't, mostly in part 2. Zaros claims that his principal concern is allowing the mortal races of the world to flourish the maximum amount possible. He differs from gods like Guthix, who also want the mortal races of the world to thrive, but while Guthix believes that they would thrive best without the gods' interference, Zaros believes that mortals need to be guided by a divine hand in order to set them on the right path. And of course not just any divine hand, but his divine hand, as Zaros sees the other gods as merely pretenders. He would later relax his view of this and allow others to worship any god they wished, as long as it didn't get in the way of his grand design. And it is not hard to see his perspective on this, as he is so much older and most likely wiser than any other self-proclaimed god. But his age and nature have molded him into what might seem to be a very cold and calculating individual. If Zaros existed in our reality, we would expect him to attempt to guide us the same way a super-intelligent AI would guide us. He would rule with a vision in mind, and this vision would be to see humanity reach their full potential. Being millions of years old, he could use his almost limitless knowledge of the universe to propel and guide humanity on a successful path to expand into the galaxy. He would be very similar to the Emperor of Mankind, if you are familiar with the world of Warhammer 40k. He would assist us to solve global and eventually galactic problems as we proliferate as a species throughout the galaxy. Zaros would be worshipped by trillions of humans across thousands of worlds given enough time. Compare this with someone like Guthix, who would let us deal with our problems without any help while he sleeps underneath the world, or someone like Saradomin, who is extremely adverse to other creeds and faiths and only helps those who worship him personally. In the world of Gielinor, Zaros also has a primary goal of becoming an elder god himself. He claims that the purpose of this goal is so that he can communicate with the elder gods and keep them from restarting the universe, as they have a habit of doing. Becoming an elder god would also grant him the ability to create and shape life, which is something he has long desired to be able to do. It could be because he is currently unable to create life that he feels so attached to being a kind of mindful parent to the life that does exist. This grand design philosophy is also why you might be critical of him, as he does not care much about individuals, only the collective. Individuals' desires would always be secondary to the betterment of the group. This is demonstrated in his initial conquest of Gielinor, as the way of life for humans in the Second Age under Zarosian rule was of poor quality, and they lived in squalor, as at the time Zaros' primary directive was establishing control over the world, not improving it. So even as he created the largest and most successful empire the world had ever seen, many people suffered underneath it. But Zaros only wanted to create a unified nation for which the mortal races could advance into the future under. He never promised to create a utopian society. I would tell you to be wary of those who would make such promises. If anyone understands the shortcomings of the empire Zaros built, it would be Zaros himself, as after his failed campaign into the Menethite Empire, he completely changed the way he ruled. And that is where we will pick up with Zaros' story in Part 2. If you want to learn about the Caridian-Zarosian War from the perspective of the Menethites, then watch my video about Iclarin, Amaskut, and the legacy of felines in the world of Runescape. Like this video if you liked it, and if you didn't, downvote the shit out of it.
Pax.